Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. You are tuned in to your local independent volunteer-run community radio station. My name is Andy and I will be hanging out with you for the next hour. Coming to you this week from Wurundjeri country, Melbourne. And in the show, we are going to be looking much further afield again. We're going to be talking with Jasmine Pilbrow and Rebekah Dowling, who have both been involved with an organisation called CPT, Community Peacemaker Teams, which is a human rights organisation, goes to conflict zones around the world to try to find non-violent ways of working for peace and justice and support people who are being oppressed. And Jasmine spent time in Palestine and Rebekah in Iraqi Kurdistan, trying to support people on the ground there. Just flagging potential conflict of interest in case you're worried. I know many of you rely on the Paradigm Shift for your impartial media in a world of vested interests, but I should say that Rebekah is my wife, actually. I think she has done great work in Iraqi Kurdistan. We're traveling around Melbourne and we did catch up with Jasmine, and I thought it'd be a good chance to talk about CPT and what it does and the experiences of being in these places. Jasmine can't go back to Palestine. She was deported from Israel a few years back, as we'll cover in the interview. Myself and Beck are going to go and visit Iraqi Kurdistan shortly, and so you might hear more about that on the Paradigm Shift. But I do think that trying to find ways to non-violently resolve conflicts is imperative in our world. As Gandhi once said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, and so many other issues that we need to deal with around, gender equality, around environmental issues and all kinds of things. You need a base level of peace and stability to try to sort some of those things out, and so we need to continue to work for peace in the world. And oppressed people, both Palestine and Kurds, they're stateless people. They've been moved around in kind of imperial power games. They've been the subject of armed repression, and they've been people who have never stopped trying to fight back, and so kind of inspiring in the way that they've continued to organise for their freedom, continue to support for each other, but they are certainly in a situation of real need. A lot of people unable to, go to their home villages. People have been completely dispossessed and disconnected from their families and things like that. But a couple of people who have been there supporting these struggles for human rights and are able to report back on it for us are Rebekah and Jasmine. So let's have a listen. I'm here with Beck and Jasmine, who have both spent time in the area we broadly call the Middle East, with human rights organisation CPT. Can you start off by telling us what CPT is?
CPT is a human rights organisation that currently work in Iraqi Kurdistan, Palestine, Colombia, and have a presence on the Mexico border and in Turtle Island and in Greece, working with local communities who are resisting occupations and violent forces within their communities.
And so you both were involved in that, Jazz in Palestine and Beck in Iraqi Kurdistan. How did you get involved in it?
So CPT was started as a Christian organisation, and I was just really interested in how Christians were opposing violence in the world, and having been involved in a lot of anti-war activism in Australia, what it would look like to do that in the places where Australia was going and fighting.
I was a 19-year-old really interested in working in a conflict zone, but didn't have any skills or knowledge of what there was available to do as a young person. And I met someone named Carol who had been working in Palestine with CPT, and she encouraged me to go along on a trip, which I did. And I really fell in love with the place and the work in Palestine.
All right, well, what does CPT do in these places? So we do want to start with Iraqi Kurdistan. What does human rights work look like there?
So in Iraqi Kurdistan, we mostly work with villagers on the border regions, so farmers and shepherds who have been living there for generations, 1,000 years, and are currently being displaced and killed by the cross-border bombing from both Turkey and Iran. And then our other project is with civil society within Iraqi Kurdistan, teachers and journalists who are being oppressed by the local government. So we work with them, visiting them in prison and working with their families for their release and advocating for better human rights policies within Kurdistan.
The work in Palestine is slightly different. You're working in a main city called Hebron. It has a large Israeli settler population within this city, as well as military bases and checkpoints within the old city of Hebron. So a lot of the work is on the ground human rights monitoring, making sure children are getting to school safely, responding to house arrest, children arrest, and any kind of unsafe situation that arises from the Israeli military, police or border police. And a lot of the work, all of the work is done in conjunction with local community groups, schools, activist groups, as well as Jewish activist groups. And there is a bit of work going to villages nearby where they're facing home demolitions by the Israeli military.
So a lot of those things you just talked about are sort of reactive things against oppression from external or internal powers there. But there is a sort of trying to proactively build peace element of organising and educating within CPT as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so the mission slogan is building partnerships to transform violence and oppression. And a large focus is building relationships within communities and supporting them to do what they think is the best way forward for finding non-violent solutions. And so running trainings on request in non-violence and supporting communication between government and villages, or demonstrations happening.
It's similar in Palestine with things around demonstrations, working with community groups on training. I think a big focus of their community work is reclaiming space. So one of the things that they did when we were there was occupying their own land by knocking down a wall and turning this about 3 square meters space into an area for a local kindergarten, and that became a place with artwork and children's equipment, which used to be an additional fencing. So things like that, supporting community as they think of creative ways of resisting the violence in their community.
CPT became famous, I guess, initially through a tactic of what they called human shields, sending Western white people to these kind of conflict zones in an attempt to get more attention paid to the violence that was happening there, quite famously in both Iraq and Palestine. That tactic has changed somewhat in the organisation. You want to talk a bit about, I guess, the pros and cons of that tactic and how that change happened?
Yeah, I think it was quite slow moving, but definitely had to do with people trying to find longevity in the project and how to stay within a community for longer and build up resistance with the local people, who it's not so easy for them necessarily to put themselves in the way like these Westerners were, and then be arrested and deported, and they're fine in the long run. Tactics changed both because of, from both a practical and philosophical point of view, seeking tactics that could be continued in the long run and provide a real friendship and partnership between people, as well as realizing that they needed to listen to what local people actually wanted to do and be led by grassroots initiatives rather than just bringing in white people to do these projects.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that last point, and would add that it was a component of it was about safety as well. So when you have foreigners coming in and risking their own safety, who are the locals that are then on the ground trying to respond to that and follow up on an arrest, or if someone is injured, who are the locals that are then in danger to assist the foreigners that are coming in. So I think it was a really good and important shift. But it's definitely a shift that I know, at least in the Palestine team, it could be really hard in situations where you wanted to physically intervene or to stand in the way of, a Palestinian being arrested, but knowing that that could actually escalate things, or that might put other people in danger, or even at the end of the day, it wasn't a long-term solution. That child might have been taken at another point. So I think it was a good change in helping to reflect and focus on what tactics could be long-term solutions to making change and ensuring the safety of the community as much as you could in your actions.
So CPT being in Palestine and Kurdistan hasn't stopped conflict necessarily, but what things do you think have come from CPT being in these places?
I think there's a lot of individual stories of, it's very hard to tell what would happen if CPT hadn't been there. But like in Kurdistan, I meet quite a lot of people who have known CPT over the years and talk about how amazing it's been, their connection to CPT, things CPT has done for them, training that's happened. CPT helped bring alternative surveillance projects into Iraqi Kurdistan and trained quite a few locals in it, and now that group's completely run by Kurdish people who love it, and they're finding new people to do the trainings, and I went to one of their trainings as to be trained, and it was amazing to just see how much passion they had for that project. And so there's lots of stories like that. Villagers who have electricity or improved roads and are really grateful for what CPT's done. People who were released from prison while I was there who were in prison for false charges and being threatened with 7 years in prison and were released after a year, and say that's just because of CPT's work.
I think with Palestine it is very small personal changes. I think something the Iraqi team does really well is that advocacy and kind of communication with politicians and government. But I think with Palestine, a big part of it is purely solidarity and getting messages out. During 2018, the UN group that was in Hebron were kicked out, and another group that were on the ground were also, they ended their project. So CPT was one of the only international groups on the ground, and they were able to continue that relationship. So I personally can't think of any kind of big changes, but I don't think that was part of CPT's goal in the sense of ending the occupation, because that's such a huge long-term goal, which is going to involve a collective of local and international organisations doing a variety of work. But I think having that solidarity, having people witness what's happening, and being part of sharing the truth of what's going on is probably the key part of CPT in Palestine.
Yeah, I want to talk about obstacles involved for peace and for, I guess, international NGOs being in these places. There's a few, and particularly, Jazz, for you came across some pretty hard obstacles in continuing your work in Palestine, and you were deported from there. Do you want to, I guess, tell us a bit about that, and then maybe other obstacles that have come up?
I think, so deportation is a huge risk for anyone that's going into Palestine to work with a human rights organisation or to just be involved or connected with Palestinians in general. And at the time when I was there, there was a heightened focus on CPT. We had been quite prominent in the community at that time, and about 8 of us were denied entry within about a year. And that's been an ongoing issue for the last 20 plus years in Palestine, and it's difficult with the work of CPT where it is about having those relationships and connections with people. Some of the other obstacles are just the general nature of the work. It is quite confronting. Each day you're faced with some form of physical violence in the community, and there are times when you do feel unsafe and you cannot leave the situation. So it is a very confronting experience for foreigners to be going into, and so then having that additional threat of being unable to go back in is hard for the foreign staff, but also the community when they are making those connections with people and trying to work long term with an organisation that just can't guarantee that safe visa.
What happened when you were deported? It's, I suppose, the interesting story. How did that play out?
So I was 99% sure that I wasn't going to get back in. A week before I had left the country previously, I had been arrested for accompanying a 14-year-old child that was being arrested. My colleague and I refused to let the soldiers take him without us as the guardian wasn't around. And as a result, we were then arrested and detained for about 5 hours and banned from the city. So I wasn't able to go back to Hebron to say my goodbyes, as I would have been at risk of breaking the law and then having a court case against me. So I knew I wasn't going to get back in, but I couldn't not give it a go. So I had gone to Jordan first because I knew my boss would be there to support me if I didn't get in. And it wasn't a terrible experience. You hear terrible stories of people getting denied entry. I was questioned for about 5 hours. They kept me waiting for about 8. They kept me in a tiny room with no food, no water, very aggressive young soldiers who were making accusations that were completely untrue. But as I had been working with the peace organisation, I knew that there was nothing I could do in that moment So yeah, not a fun experience. We had all been prepared, and you do know that that's a risk of joining the CPT team in Palestine. But yeah, it never gets easy. And then the following day or two later, they were actually doing a training for CPT workers in Jordan at the time, and I helped run a session on preparation for being deported. So we pretty much played out what happened to me with the new trainees, which was helpful for them.
What about in Iraqi Kurdistan? What are some of the obstacles?
It's very easy to get the visa for Australians. Get a visa on arrival, you pay a bit of money and you're in. And then moving within Kurdistan is fairly easy as well for foreigners. It's much harder if you're Arabic, actually, because of the Kurdish history with oppression from Arabs in the surrounding countries. But I don't think there's very many obstacles for foreigners for doing our work, other than very general ones of when you're criticising the government, there is the risk that they will arrest you.
Yeah, it's different. I guess in Palestine you are critical of the occupying Israel government, but probably within Palestine there's support for you being there, I would assume, whereas in Iraqi Kurdistan often the human rights abuses that you were working against came from the Iraqi Kurdistan government, and so did that provide additional challenges?
Yeah, we have a registration within Kurdistan. We have registration as an NGO to work as an NGO, and we have to renew it every year, which is often a long and tiring process, and it's renewed by the political party in power, of which we often publish critical articles. And so every time there's a risk of, are they going to deny our registration this time? In which case we wouldn't legally be able to work. If we continue to work, we could be shut down. All the foreigners could be kicked out, and our local teammates could be arrested. So it is, that's something we're always having to juggle, how to stay on relatively good terms with the government while still authentically critiquing them and supporting marginalized and oppressed people. I was actually thinking that one of the issues we do have with getting to areas is around us being critical of the Turkish cross-border bombings, and that one political party in particular has close ties with Turkey, and where the checkpoints that they man will try and stop us going into certain areas, particularly where the Turkish military has established itself quite significantly, and that there are now Turkish military checkpoints within Iraqi Kurdistan as well that we wouldn't be able to get through.
You are both women, small in stature, if not in heart, The Middle East has a reputation, I guess, in the rest of the world, deserved or not, but also I guess the work that you're doing is often physically dangerous. I wonder if there are particular challenges that have come to you as women doing this work in that part of the world that you don't think men would have.
I must say, speaking Arabic changed my experience. So the first 3 months I was there, I barely spoke much Arabic, and when I went back, I found that I was listened to a lot more and treated better than my foreign male colleagues who didn't speak Arabic. So I do think having that ability helped navigate an often in any society situation where men are listened to more than women. Outside of that, I never felt unsafe within the local community as a woman. I did around the soldiers. They were mainly young men, younger than me at the time, and I was targeted quite a bit with sexual advances and things like that. So it was a very, definitely women had a very different experience to my male colleagues. But then in addition to that, having non-binary colleagues, they were in an even tougher situation at the time, often unable to be presenting as their true self due to fear of being harassed by any community member or the military. So there's definitely those dynamics at play, which are at play everywhere.
Yeah, I didn't particularly think it was harder for me. Part of it is being a foreigner, I think, and so you're not just a woman, you're a foreigner. And there are quite a lot of women there in positions of authority, working for embassies or other organizations as well, and so it's not that unusual. I don't think in terms of the work we were doing there was anything in particular about being female that changed. I think it was harder to live there, perhaps, as a woman than it was for the men. I found it much harder to meet females to make friends with. There was general restrictions about entering places that are only male spaces, or going out by yourself as a woman. You would get more stares sometimes, but I didn't actually, I never put myself in a situation where I felt unsafe, and I felt like I got to do most of what I wanted to do. Male colleagues who were foreigners who'd come definitely, I think, found it easier socially to meet people and to hang out with them as well.
Another challenge that I find interesting is that CPT is an openly pacifist organisation, and that's, I guess, part of the reason going into these conflict zones. And it's interesting, particularly in both Palestine and Kurdistan, that both these regions have a history of violent resistance to violent oppression, and that's quite a lot of the perception from outside, but also I think self-identified a lot of pride in that kind of resistance, the Intifada, or the Kurdish sort of paramilitary kind of resistance. What was the dynamic of being a pacifist organisation in those environments?
Yeah, there was a couple of different things at play, like people's personal politics and how they felt about the armed resistance, and then the organization's stance on it, as well as the legal stance, which you had to negotiate as well. So in Kurdistan, the PKK is considered a terrorist organization by most Western countries, and I think it's the US has very strict laws around any organization to be seen working with the PKK can lose their registration and people can be arrested. And so we, purely from a legal standpoint, had to maintain a distance for the sake of our work and American colleagues that would be coming. And then it's a complicated history within Kurdistan of people who have been very oppressed and support the PKK and an armed resistance to that oppression. And Iraqi Kurdistan itself had Peshmerga who fought Saddam's army and the genocide against Kurds there, and now have one semi-autonomy. And so there's a fair amount of support in that, and then there's also people who just want to live their daily lives and don't want to continue to be involved in an armed conflict. and are forced to be by proximity, and are very angry about that as well. I think as an international organisation, we didn't try to convince people in any particular way. Who are local, they can make up their own choices, but we're a pacifist organisation and do not work with armed groups. And so we're very clear continuously about that in situations where we were being asked to, in some way, communicate or work with them.
We never really had issues with any groups that we worked with ever inclining that we should speak with or be involved with any groups that may have been armed or used any form of violent means. And I think that was just purely based on the local nature of our work. We weren't travelling much, so we were very much in a very confined area with those long kind of 20 plus year history of relationships with people. But like Beck has mentioned, there are those overall situations, and yeah, like Beck mentioned, we never kind of pushed our message of non-violence. It was just purely our stance and our presence in the country. But I think it's important to note with Palestine and probably everywhere they're working, the military and the Israeli government were still often implying or portraying CPT in situations as being part of a riot if we were at a protest or things like that. So there was always this portrayal of anyone supporting Palestine may be involved in some form of violent oppression. So yes, again, that kind of focus of the international governments as well as Israel trying to portray Palestine as a violent resistor and never Israel as a violent state, always the oppressed.
Well, you are both in Australia now and away from these places where you spent time and working, but both Kurdistan and Palestine have been in the news a bit recently for natural disasters, oppressive governments, protests in Iran, things like that. What do you think the future look like, particularly, I guess, for CPT?
I think for Palestine it's changing. It has been really difficult for foreigners to get into the country, and if they are, to continually get in multiple times. So the nature of the team is changing and becoming more local, which is a really positive outcome, and can potentially make it a more sustainable and long-term team, and potentially have it will have new ways of working and have a lot stronger of a local insight. So that's really exciting to see unfold, and it will be interesting to see whether that continues as a CPT project or if that then becomes more of a localized community organisation.
Yeah, I think in the last couple of years, CPT's profile within Iraqi Kurdistan has grown quite a lot. We've been very busy doing a lot of work and have regularly been asked to expand within the country, to open up an office in each of the major cities or move to one of the major cities. I don't see that happening, and I don't see the team that we have there, which is very small, maximum of 6 people, growing either. Both because of there's not that many people willing to do that kind of work, and struggling to continue to find funding as well. CPT is run purely off donations and doesn't accept government donations or government sponsorship or whatever you want to call it. And so it's been primarily through individuals and churches that they've managed to do that work. And it's always been a struggle to find that funding and continues to be.
Are there things that fill you with hope for the future in those places?
I read a book recently, an old Noam Chomsky book, and he talked about Israel causing its own destruction, and that gave me a little bit of hope because they're not stopping and they're only amping it up in Palestine. And it's just really hard to see any change happening on the ground, and people are doing everything that they can. The international community is not doing enough, but that gave me a little bit of hope of maybe the oppressor will just destroy itself by its inability to make any compromise or any abidance to human rights in Palestine. We'll see.
I think because of the nature of our work, we meet a lot of activists, and I'm always inspired by that, like these people who have amazing ideas and are willing to put so much on the line for their beliefs, and what they're managing to achieve and do is really inspiring. And I think, oh well, if these people continue to exist, surely something's got to change eventually.
That's the hope, yeah. All right, if people want to find out more about CPT, how can they do so?
CPT.org. Each team has their own social media pages you can follow on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, as well as their own websites. But there's a centralized website of cpt.org as well, and you can go on a mailing list there.
All right. Thanks very much, Beck and Jazz.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That was Rebekah Dowling and Jasmine Pilbrow, though, two women who have been spending time, a few years each, in the Middle East working with CPT, trying to find non-violent resolutions to ongoing conflicts there, and supporting Kurds and Palestinians, two, I guess, stateless peoples with so many barriers to get to the kind of basic rights which we take for granted here. As they said, you can find out more or support the work that CPT do by heading to their website, cpt.org. That's about all we have time for on Paradigm Shift. I hope you enjoyed the show today. I'm privileged to know some of these people who have been, trying to creatively find ways to confront some of the problems in the world, and not just some of the small problems that we deal with here, which take up a lot of our time if we're involved in activism and organising, but also these big questions around international conflicts and human rights and what we can do. And so it's good to talk to people like Jasmine and Beck. See you next week.